The conference call ended with a sharp digital chirp that severed the connection to Tokyo. That was it. The beep signaled the end of an 18-month war of attrition, a merger that had consumed every waking hour of my life. The silence that rushed into the room wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. The hum of the server room down the hall seemed to grow louder, a constant, low-frequency thrum vibrating through the mahogany table. The air smelled of ozone and cooling electronics, the scent of machines powering down after running too hot for too long. At the head of the table, Luna didn't cheer. She didn't triumphantly stack her papers. She slumped back in her leather chair, the structure of her posture collapsing, as if her spine had been held up by sheer will alone. She looked hollowed out, a victor sitting in the wreckage of her own conquest. And I was the only one left to see the cracks in the armor. The adrenaline didn't just fade, it crashed. It felt like a high-tension wire snapping inside my chest, the recoil hitting me with a physical force that nearly buckled my knees. For months, we had been operating on a cocktail of cortisol and ambition, a two-woman engine driving this deal through a swamp of regulatory hurdles and ego-driven negotiations. Now, the engine had stalled, and the silence was deafening. Around us, the rest of the executive team was performing the ritual of departure. There was the snapping of leather briefcases, the confident click of expensive pens being capped, the performative sighs of relief meant to signal a job well done. They clapped each other on the shoulders, murmuring about stock options and quarterly projections, their voices booming with that specific, hollow confidence that fills corporate spaces. They offered Luna their congratulations, of course, brief, firm handshakes, nods of respect that didn't quite reach their eyes. They looked at the title, at the victory, at the numbers on the whiteboard. They didn't see the way her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, or the way her eyes had gone unfocused, staring at a point somewhere beyond the glass walls of the conference room. One by one, they filtered out, a stream of charcoal suits and polished Oxfords flowing toward the elevators. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind the last of them. The VP of Operations, who was already on his phone making dinner reservations. And then, the executive floor was truly empty. I should have followed them. My body was screaming for it. My bones felt like lead pipes, heavy and aching. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets and contract clauses for 48 hours straight. Every rational circuit in my brain was firing the command to leave, to go home, to collapse into my own bed and sleep for a week. But my feet remained rooted to the plush gray carpet. I watched her through the glass wall of her office, the fishbowl, as we called it. She had moved from the conference table to her desk, but she hadn't sat down. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. The San Francisco skyline was a grid of bioluminescent ambition, a sprawling network of lights and fog. To anyone else, she looked like the master of all she surveyed. But I knew her better than that. I knew the tilt of her head when she was calculating a risk. I knew the tension in her shoulders when she was bracing for impact. Right now, she wasn't calculating. She was decoding. She was staring at the city lights like they were a complex encryption key she had forgotten the password to. She looked small against the backdrop of the night, a silhouette of sharp lines and tailored fabric that suddenly seemed too fragile to hold up the weight of the company she had just saved. The magnetic pull was undeniable. It wasn't just loyalty, though God knows I had enough of that. It was something sharper, more visceral. It was the proximity. For months, we had been in the trenches together, sharing takeout at 3 a.m., correcting each other's pitch decks, breathing the same recycled air. I had become attuned to her frequency. I could sense the shift in her energy from across the room. And right now, the signal she was broadcasting was pure, unadulterated isolation. I walked to the elevator bank. I pressed the button. The arrow lit up, a cheerful, bright white. But when the doors slid open with a soft ding, revealing the empty, mirrored car that would take me down to the lobby and away from her, I couldn't step inside. It felt like trying to walk through a force field. The connection tethering me to that office, to that woman standing alone in the dark was stronger than my exhaustion. I let the doors close without me. The metal slid shut, swallowing my reflection, and I turned back toward the executive suite. My body simply refused to leave her orbit. I pushed the heavy glass door open, and the sound of the latch clicking shut behind me was louder than it should have been. It echoed in the stillness, a definitive punctuation mark that separated us from the rest of the world. Stepping back into her office felt different this time. 10 minutes ago, this room had been a command center, a high-altitude bunker where we mapped out hostile takeovers and analyzed risk assessments. Now, with the servers cooling down and the city sleeping below us, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, viscous almost, charged with a kind of unspent static that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the frantic energy of the deal anymore. It was the heavy, rolling pressure of a weather system that had stalled directly overhead. I wasn't entering as her subordinate. I wasn't the vice president of strategy coming to debrief the CEO. That hierarchy had evaporated the moment the last signature hit the digital paper. I was entering as the only other person on the planet who understood the exact weight of the burden she had just set down. I was the witness. And as I walked deeper into the room, moving past the low leather chairs where we'd spent countless hours arguing over valuation caps, I realized I was trespassing on a moment of privacy she guarded with the ferocity of a lioness. Luna was leaning back against the edge of her massive oak desk, her ankles crossed, staring at the floor. She didn't look up when I walked in. She didn't need to. We had spent so many hours in close proximity that we had developed a kind of radar for each other, a silent telemetry that tracked presence and mood without a single word being exchanged. She knew I was there, and she didn't tell me to leave. That silence was the first permission. Then came the sound. It was small, distinct, and shockingly intimate. She reached down, unbuckling the strap of her left heel, and let it drop. The shoe hit the carpet with a muffled thud, followed a second later by the right one. It seems like a trivial thing, taking off your shoes. But for Luna, it was a dismantling. Those heels were part of the architecture of her authority. They were 3 inches of steel-reinforced dominance that she used to tower over board members and intimidate competitors. Seeing her stand there in her stocking feet, suddenly 3 inches shorter, grounded against the plush carpet, felt like watching a statue breathe. It was a vulnerability she never allowed during daylight hours, a crack in the porcelain facade of the Iron CEO that the business journals loved to write about. She let out a long, ragged breath, her head tilting back towards the ceiling. Her hands came up, moving with a slow, deliberate lethargy that mesmerized me. She reached for the back of her head, her fingers finding the structural integrity of the chignon she wore like a crown every single day. I stopped walking. I just watched. She pulled the first pin, then the second. They made a tiny, sharp clatter as she dropped them onto the polished wood of the desk. It was a slow-motion collapse of the professional silhouette I had memorized. When the last pin came free, she shook her head, and the dark cascade of her hair fell loose. It tumbled over her shoulders, spilling down her back in a heavy, dark wave that softened every sharp angle of her suit. The transformation was visceral. The CEO vanished, and the woman underneath, the one who drank too much coffee, who worried about her legacy, who carried the weight of 3,000 employees on her back, emerged. The scent of her shampoo, something warm and floral that usually stayed hidden beneath the smell of ozone and dry erase markers, suddenly drifted through the room. It was a sensory shift that rewired the context of the space. She finally turned to look at me. Her hair was framing her face in a way that made her look younger, softer, and infinitely more dangerous to my peace of mind. Her gaze was wide open. There were no walls up, no strategic filters in place. It was a raw, unguarded look that acknowledged my presence, not as an intrusion, but as a necessity. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The look said, "I am still here, but I am done fighting." She pushed off the desk, moving away from the fortress of her workspace, and took a step toward the center of the room. The distance between us was closing, not just physically, but emotionally. The professional boundaries that had kept us safe were blurring, dissolving into the static that hummed between us. She moved toward the rosewood credenza that lined the far wall, her stocking feet sinking into the carpet, making her movements silent, almost ghostly. The only sound in the room was the heavy, distinctive clink of the crystal stopper being lifted from the decanter. It was a sound I knew well, the sound of a crisis averted, or a disaster confirmed. Tonight, it was the sound of survival. She didn't ask if I wanted one. She simply reached for 2 heavy tumblers, the glass thick and faceted, catching the low light of the desk lamp like captured fire. The amber liquid poured with a smooth, viscous glug, splashing against the bottom of the glasses. It was the 25-year-old single malt she kept for closing deals or burying bodies, and I wasn't sure which category tonight fell into. She added ice from the silver bucket, the cubes cracking as the room temperature spirit hit them, a sharp, fracturing noise that echoed the tension in my own chest. She turned, holding a glass in each hand, and for the first time, she didn't head back to the fortress of her desk. Instead, she walked toward the seating area in the corner, a space designed for casual intimidation, furnished with a low emerald velvet sofa that faced the panoramic window. She sank into the corner of the sofa, curling her legs up beneath her, tucking her feet under the hem of her skirt. It was such a domestic, casual posture that I blinked, momentarily disoriented. She patted the velvet cushion beside her. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, silent and heavy. "Come here," she said, her voice rough, stripped of its usual polished cadence. "I don't want to drink this alone." I walked over, my own exhaustion making my movements heavy, and sat. I didn't take the armchair opposite her, the safe, professional distance. I sat where she indicated, on the sofa. The cushion dipped under my weight, shifting the gravity of the room. Suddenly, the meters of corporate distance that usually separated us were reduced to inches. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, smell the sandalwood and expensive paper that clung to her skin, mixed with the sharp peat smoke scent of the whiskey. She handed me the glass, her fingers brushing mine. The contact was brief, electric, a spark jumping across the gap. I took a sip, the liquid burning a clean, hot path down my throat, settling in my stomach like a heavy stone. "I thought we lost it," she said quietly, staring into her glass as if the answers were suspended in the amber fluid. "At 2 p.m., when the regulatory approval stalled, I thought it was over. I thought I'd have to walk out there and tell 3,000 people that I'd failed them." "You didn't fail," I said, my voice steady, falling into the role of the anchor I had played for 18 months. "You outmaneuvered them. The pivot to the Singapore holding company? That was brilliant, Luna. You saved the legacy." She let out a short, humorless laugh and took a long swallow of her drink. Brilliant? No. It was desperate. I felt like a fraud the entire time, sitting there, nodding at the lawyers, pretending I understood the intricacies of international maritime law. I felt like a child wearing her mother's heels. She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and searching. Does it ever stop? The feeling that someone is going to walk in, tap you on the shoulder, and tell you to get out of the chair because you don't belong there. I looked at her, really looked at her. The moonlight from the window washed over her face, highlighting the shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, the faint lines of tension around her mouth. I had spent years admiring her competence. I had a visceral, almost physical reaction to watching her work, the way she dissected problems, the ruthless efficiency of her intellect. It was a professional competence kink I had never named, but always felt. But seeing her now, stripping away the armor to reveal the soft, terrified human underneath, was infinitely more potent. "It's not fraud if you win," I said softly. "And you always win." "Only because you're standing right behind me," she whispered. The admission hung in the air, heavier than the silence, blurring the professional boundaries not out of negligence, but out of a sudden, terrifying necessity. I can't do this alone. The words were barely a whisper, dropped into the quiet space between us like a lit match. It wasn't a delegation of authority. It wasn't a request for a new hiring plan or a directive to outsource the stress to a junior team. It was a total, absolute surrender. I froze, my hand tightening around my glass. In the 5 years I had worked for Luna, through market crashes, hostile board takeovers, and the brutal, sleepless grind of this merger, I had never heard her admit to a limit. She was the woman who famously took a red-eye from London to New York, showered in the lounge, and closed a Series C round before breakfast. She was the architectural steel that held this company upright. Hearing her voice crack, hearing that admission of finite strength, acted as a catalyst that shattered the last thin layer of my professional reserve. I looked at her, really looked at her, and the weight of that confession hit me in the chest with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just fear, it was permission. By admitting she couldn't carry the weight, she was implicitly asking me to help her bear it. And not as her VP of strategy, but as something else. Something undefined, terrifyingly intimate, and completely necessary. My response was instinctual, bypassing the logical centers of my brain that usually vetted every word I said to her. I didn't offer a platitude about teamwork. I didn't quote a management philosophy or bring up the projected revenue models. "You aren't alone," I said, my voice dropping an octave, matching the hush of the room. I shifted on the sofa, turning my body fully toward her, blocking out the view of the city, blocking out the company, making myself the only point of reference in her field of vision. "You have never been alone. Not for a single second of this fight." She looked up from her glass, her eyes locking onto mine. The vulnerability there was raw, open, and devastating. It was the look of someone who has been treading water for days, finally seeing the shore. "I know," she whispered, and the way she said it, breathless, shaky, sent a jolt of heat straight down my spine. "That's the only reason I'm still standing. But I'm tired, Maya. I am so incredibly tired of being the one who has to know the answer." "Then stop," I said. The command hung in the air, bold and dangerous. "Stop knowing the answer. Just for tonight. Let the world spin without you for a few hours. It won't fall apart. I won't let it." I validated her strength by acknowledging the cost of it. I saw the relief wash over her, a physical slackening of the tension in her jaw. It was an intimate exchange, far more personal than if we had been discussing our childhoods or our fears. We were discussing the very core of our dynamic, renegotiating the terms of our existence in real time. The atmosphere in the room thickened, becoming viscous and heavy. The sprawling lights of San Francisco outside the glass seemed to blur, fading into a meaningless abstract painting. The server room down the hall, the empty cubicles, the stock price, it all ceased to exist. The world narrowed down to the 4 feet of velvet sofa, the smell of peat and sandalwood, and the sound of her breathing, which was syncing, slowly, with mine. I watched the way her throat worked as she swallowed a sip of whiskey. I watched the way her fingers, usually so steady, gripped the heavy crystal glass as if it were an anchor. The confident explorer in me recognized the terrain we were entering. We were moving off the map of professional conduct and into the uncharted territory of shared need. Words were no longer enough. The reassurance I was offering, verbal, logical, was bouncing off the surface. She didn't need to hear that I was there. She needed to feel it. The emotional gravity between us had become too strong for language. A physical ache started in my palms, a magnetic need to bridge the gap, to offer tactile proof that I wasn't going anywhere. The air between us crackled, charged with the static of things unspoken, and I knew, with a sudden, crystal clarity, that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. My hand moved before my mind authorized the action. It was a breach of protocol so severe it would have been grounds for termination in any other context. But the logic of the boardroom didn't apply here. We were operating on a new frequency, one where the standard rules of engagement had been suspended by exhaustion and whiskey. I watched my own hand as if it belonged to someone else, reaching across the velvet no-man's land that separated us on the sofa. I covered her hand with mine. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't a demand, it was an anchor. I laid my palm over the back of her hand where it rested on the cushion, her fingers still loosely curled around the heavy crystal glass. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp circuit closing between us. I expected her to flinch. I expected the CEO to snap back into place, for her to pull away and make a joke about being tired, reestablishing the safe, sterile distance of our professional lives. She didn't pull away. Instead, the reaction was immediate and devastatingly surrendered. The moment my skin touched hers, the tension that had been holding her upright seemed to cut loose. She let out a breath she must have been holding since the merger talks began 18 months ago. A long, shaky exhale that shuddered through her entire frame. She leaned into the touch. It was a subtle movement, a shift of maybe 2 inches, but the implication was seismic. She was leaning her weight against my stability. Her breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, began to slow, deepening until it fell into a heavy, rhythmic sync with my own. I sat there, frozen in the magnitude of the moment, hyper-aware of the sensory details crashing over me. The air around us was no longer just recycled office climate control. It was a localized atmosphere of intimacy. I could smell the sandalwood perfume she always wore, a scent that usually signaled her arrival in a boardroom, sharp and commanding. But here, mixed with the warmth radiating from her skin and the faint, dusty smell of expensive paper and old books, it was softer. It was the scent of her, not the scent of the boss. I could feel the heat of her skin seeping into my palm, a stark contrast to the cold condensation on the whiskey glass she was holding. I moved my thumb just a fraction of an inch, tracing the delicate ridge of her knuckles. It was a soothing, repetitive motion, the kind you use to calm a startled animal or ground a panic attack. Under my thumb, I felt the fine tremors in her hand begin to still. The atmosphere in the room coiled tight, but it wasn't the stress of the deal anymore. It was something else entirely. For years, my attraction to Luna had been buried under layers of professional admiration. It was a competence kink, a deep, abiding fascination with her intellect, her ruthlessness, her ability to command a room. I had loved her brain, her power, her invincibility. But feeling her tremble under my hand, witnessing the cracks in the armor, shifted the axis of that attraction. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was a hunger. It was a fierce, protective, and undeniably romantic need to be the one place where she didn't have to be strong. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I didn't just want to work for her. I wanted to take care of her. I wanted to take the weight she carried and put it on my own shoulders, just to see her breathe easier. We sat in that charged silence for what felt like hours, though it could only have been seconds. The city lights outside were forgotten. The empty office was forgotten. The only thing that existed was the point of contact between my hand and hers. Then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head. She didn't look at the window. She didn't look at the whiskey. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide, swallowing the iris. She held my gaze for a heartbeat, searching for something: reassurance, hesitation, judgment. When she found none of those things, when she saw only the raw, open reflection of my own desire, her gaze dropped. She looked at my lips. It was a silent permission, a silent plea. It was the final signal that the bridge was down, the gates were open, and the territory we were about to enter belonged only to us. I didn't ask. Asking would have reintroduced logic into a moment that was surviving entirely on instinct. If I had spoken, if I had tried to verbalize the sudden, terrifying gravity pulling us together, the spell would have shattered. The board members would have returned to the room. The stock price would have mattered again. The hierarchy would have reasserted its cold, hard structure. So I didn't speak. I simply let the last few inches of distance between us collapse. It wasn't a tentative approach. I didn't lean in with the hesitation of a subordinate afraid of overstepping. I moved with the certainty of a partner who finally understood the assignment. When I closed the gap, it felt less like a choice and more like a physical inevitability, like two magnets finally snapping together after being held apart by force for 18 months. Her lips were softer than I expected. That was my first coherent thought, flashing through the haze of adrenaline and desire. For years, I had watched her mouth form sharp, cutting sentences that dismantled competitors and rallied investors. I had seen her lips pressed into a thin, white line of determination during crisis meetings. I had expected resistance, or hardness, or the metallic taste of stress. Instead, she was warm, yielding, and tasted of peat smoke and the faint, sweet ghost of the cherries she sometimes kept on her desk. The kiss initiated not with aggression, but with a desperate magnetic pull. It was the sensation of a dam breaking. The moment our mouths connected, a low, fractured sound vibrated in her throat, a noise of pure, unadulterated relief that vibrated against my own lips. It was the sound of the iron CEO finally putting her shield down. She didn't pull away. She didn't freeze. She surged forward, meeting me with a hunger that matched my own, her mouth opening slightly to deepen the contact, transforming the moment from a tentative question into a definitive answer. I felt the heavy crystal glass slide from her fingers. It hit the velvet cushion with a muffled thud, tilting dangerously, but not spilling, forgotten the instant it left her hand. Her hands, now free, didn't hesitate. They flew up, seeking purchase, gripping the lapels of my blazer with a force that bunched the expensive fabric. She pulled me closer, effectively erasing the last millimeter of space between us. The sensation was overwhelming. It was a sensory overload that short-circuited every professional protocol I had ever memorized. The contrast was dizzying. The roughness of the long day, the sharp edges of our business personas, colliding with the shocking softness of this intimacy. It was the taste of 25-year-old whiskey and the salt of unshed tears. It was the release of months of suppressed desire, a pressure valve finally being turned. My hands found their way to her face. I cupped her jaw, my thumbs tracing the line of tension that had been etched there for weeks. Her skin was fever hot under my cool palms. I moved my fingers up, tangling them into the dark, heavy waves of her hair, destroying the last evidence of her polished, professional silhouette. I needed to feel the reality of her, the chaotic, unmanaged texture of her hair, to ground myself in the truth that this was actually happening. Inside my mind, a voice that usually cataloged risks and managed liabilities went silent. There was no panic. There was no, "What have I done?" Instead, there was a profound, resonating clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a drunken slip-up induced by exhaustion and relief. This was the inevitable conclusion to the partnership we had built. We had spent years syncing our minds, aligning our strategies, finishing each other's sentences. This physical alignment was just the final piece of data falling into place. It felt like the code had finally compiled without errors. She shifted, her knees bumping against mine, and the friction sent a fresh wave of electricity through me. Her grip on my blazer loosened, her hands sliding up over my shoulders, her palms pressing hard against the tension knots in my neck. She was grounding herself in me, using my physical presence as the fulcrum to leverage herself out of the isolation she'd been living in. I mapped the stress in her shoulders with my own hands, kneading the tight muscles, smoothing away the armor she wore so well. The kiss deepened, shifting gears. The initial desperation of "I need comfort" bled into something darker, slower, and infinitely more sultry. It became an exploration. Her tongue brushed against mine, a tentative electric tasting that made my breath hitch. The rhythm changed from the frantic pace of survival to the slow, heavy cadence of desire. She wasn't just the boss needing a lifeline anymore. She was a woman who wanted to be touched, and I was the only person in the world she trusted enough to let in. The professional world outside the window had ceased to exist. The only reality was the heat of her breath, the taste of whiskey, and the undeniable fact that we were crossing a line that would change the landscape of our lives forever. The kiss wasn't just a collision anymore. It was a conversation we had been denying ourselves for years, finally spoken aloud in the only language that mattered. I felt her hands move from my shoulders to the back of my neck, her fingers threading through the short hair at the nape, pulling me closer until the concept of personal space was nothing but a memory. The friction of fabric, the rough, structured wool of my blazer against the smooth, cool silk of her blouse, created a static charge that felt like it was sparking directly against my skin. I shifted my weight, one knee pressing gently between hers on the velvet sofa to stabilize us, and she made a soft, broken sound in her throat. It wasn't the polished vocalization of a CEO. It was a noise of pure, unadulterated want that shattered the last of my restraint. This wasn't the Luna who commanded boardrooms with a raised eyebrow. That armor lay in a metaphorical pile of discarded expectations on the floor, right next to her heels. This was Luna, the woman, unraveling in my arms. I ran my hands down the length of her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the thin silk, mapping the tension that was slowly, finally, leaving her body. It felt like a perfectly executed merger, two distinct, powerful entities finally aligning their assets into something far more formidable than the sum of their parts. For 18 months, we had negotiated terms, analyzed risks, and leveraged every ounce of our intellect to survive the hostile landscape of the market. But this was the only negotiation that truly mattered. There were no clauses here, no exit strategies, no golden parachutes to save us if we fell. There was just the undeniable, terrifying reality of skin on skin, the heat of her breath against the sensitive skin of my neck, and the way her heart hammered a frantic, syncopated rhythm against my chest. It was the closing of the deal of a lifetime, signed not in ink on a legal pad, but in the desperate, heated pressure of her lips moving against mine. I realized then, with a jolt of clarity that cut through the haze of desire, that every late night, every shared coffee, every glance across a crowded conference table had been due diligence for this exact moment. The synergy wasn't in the business plan. It was right here, on this sofa. "Maya," she whispered, pulling back just enough to look at me, her forehead resting against mine. Her voice was wrecked, stripped of all its polished authority, rough with an emotion she hadn't approved for public release. Her eyes were dark, dilated, searching mine with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. I didn't know if you saw me, or just the title, just the function." "I see you," I murmured back, my voice low and steady, the anchor she needed. I brushed a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead, my thumb lingering on the pulse point at her temple, feeling the rapid flutter of her life beneath my skin. "I have always seen you, Luna. The title is just the noise. You are the signal. I'm not here for the CEO. I'm here for the woman who takes her coffee black because she doesn't have time for sugar, and who stares at the city lights when she thinks no one is watching." She closed her eyes, letting out a shuddering breath, and leaned into my touch, a gesture of such profound trust, it felt heavier than the physical intimacy. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, wrapped in a tangle of limbs and longing. The frenetic energy of the initial kiss slowed, shifting gears into a deep, rhythmic cadence. It wasn't about the rush of the acquisition anymore. It was about the integration. It was about the way her hand found mine, interlacing our fingers, locking us together in a grip that defied the trembling of her hands. It was the silent acknowledgement that we were the only two people in the universe who existed in this bubble of time. The city outside could have burned down, the servers could have crashed, the stock price could have plummeted to zero, and I wouldn't have moved an inch. I was holding the most valuable asset in my world, and for the first time in her life, she was letting herself be held without checking the ROI. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with contentment, a quiet victory that tasted sweeter than any corporate win we had ever celebrated. The silence that washed back into the room wasn't the hollow, ringing vacuum that had greeted us when the conference call ended. It had changed texture entirely. It was no longer the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. It was a warm, heavy, and substantial stillness that settled over us like a weighted blanket, pressing the reality of the last 20 minutes into the very fibers of the velvet sofa. The hum of the server room down the hall was still there, a distant mechanical heartbeat, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like the engine of a ship that had finally, after a long and treacherous voyage, dropped anchor in calm waters. We remained close, a tangle of limbs and expensive fabrics that would have been impossible to explain to a board of directors. Luna was resting her head on my shoulder, her breathing slow and even, the frantic, shallow gasps of her earlier panic completely gone. My arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her against me, and I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of her heart beating against my side. It was a grounding, physical metronome that synced perfectly with my own. The empty whiskey glass lay on its side on the carpet where it had fallen, a crystal relic of a crisis that had passed, catching a stray beam of light from the street lamps below. I looked past the disarray of her dark hair to the floor-to-ceiling window. An hour ago, that view of the San Francisco skyline had been a looming, oppressive judgment, a grid of competition and expectation that Luna felt she couldn't decipher. Now, it was just a backdrop. The bioluminescent sprawl of the city, with its fog-blurred streetlights and towering skyscrapers, had been demoted. It was no longer the main character in the story. We were. The city was just the scenery for our shared peace, a glittering, silent audience to the fact that we had survived. I waited for the panic to set in. I waited for the familiar, cold slide of anxiety that usually follows a crossed line in a professional setting. The fear of HR, the terror of the morning meeting, the awkwardness of the elevator ride. I scanned my internal emotional landscape for regret, for the sinking feeling that I had just destroyed my career for a moment of comfort, but it wasn't there. Instead, there was a profound, crystalline clarity. It was a confident certainty that settled deep in my chest, replacing the adrenaline crash. This didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a correction. For 18 months, we had been operating with a critical system error, the pretense that we were just colleagues, just a CEO and her strategist. That pretense had been the friction in the machine. Now that it was gone, stripped away by exhaustion and honesty, everything felt aligned. The fear of the morning sun was absent because I knew, with absolute conviction, that the woman resting in my arms wasn't going to retreat behind her title when the sun came up. We had seen too much of each other's raw, unedited humanity to ever go back to the fiction of pure professionalism. Luna stirred, shifting slightly against me. The movement was slow, reluctant, as if she were testing the structural integrity of the moment. She didn't pull away immediately. She lifted her head, her hair falling back from her face, and looked at me. Her eyes were clear now, the dark, dilated look of desperation replaced by a soft, tired warmth. She didn't look like the iron CEO. She looked like a woman who had just woken up from a very long, very bad dream to find herself exactly where she needed to be. "So," she said, her voice a low rasp that vibrated against my chest. She cleared her throat, a small, human sound that bridged the gap back to reality. That wasn't in the quarterly projections. I let out a soft laugh, the sound easy and unforced. No, I think we went a little off script. Off script, she repeated, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth, a smile I had never seen in a boardroom. I think we rewrote the whole damn play. She sat up slowly, creating a few inches of space between us, but she kept her hand resting on my knee, a physical anchor that said, I am moving, but I am not leaving. I should be panicking, she admitted, looking down at her hand on my leg. I should be drafting a liability waiver, but I just feel quiet. For the first time in 2 years, Maya, my head is quiet. That's the goal, I said softly, covering her hand with mine again. We can worry about the logistics tomorrow. Tonight, you just get to be quiet. Okay, she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a signed contract. Okay. Then, the reality of the building asserted itself. The distant, rhythmic thump of a heavy vacuum cleaner started on the floor above us. The cleaning crew. The timestamp of the ordinary world encroaching on our sanctuary. We both froze, listening to the mundane sound of industrial maintenance, and the spell of the suspended moment began to thin. We couldn't stay on the velvet sofa forever. The merger was done, the night was ending, and the world was waiting to see what we would do next. The transition back to the vertical world was a slow, deliberate reconstruction of the women who ran the company. We moved away from the sofa, the velvet retaining the ghost of our forms, and began the ritual of putting the armor back on. But the armor didn't fit the same way anymore. When Luna slid her feet back into her heels, the movement lacked its usual aggressive snap. She smoothed her skirt, but she didn't check her phone. She checked me. She caught my eye in the reflection of the darkened window, and a small, conspiratorial smile broke through. It was terrifyingly intimate, a secret shared in the heart of the fortress. She didn't pin her hair back up. She let it fall loose, a dark, defiant banner that signaled the shift in regime. She picked up her clutch, her fingers brushing against the leather, and for a moment, she looked at the empty whiskey glass on the floor. It was a monument to what we had just survived, and what we had just started. The office felt different now. Less like a cage, and more like a cocoon we were reluctant to leave. We walked to the elevator bank in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of the last year. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had just survived a shipwreck and found themselves on the same life raft. When the doors slid open, we stepped into the mirrored box. As we descended 40 floors, I watched our reflection. To the outside world, we looked impeccable, the CEO and her right hand, tired but triumphant. But the mirror told the real story. It showed the way we gravitated toward each other, standing just inside the boundaries of personal space. It showed the way her hand drifted down, her knuckles brushing against mine. A deliberate, grounding contact that sent a fresh wave of static through my nervous system. I could still smell the sandalwood on my own skin, a sensory brand that marked me as hers. The numbers on the display counted down, but my heart rate was climbing. The fear of the ground floor, of the public eye, was real. But the heat radiating from her arm next to mine was stronger. This was the new normal. This was the partnership 2.0. The lobby was a cavern of marble and shadow, the air conditioning humming a low artificial tune. We nodded to the night guard, a performance of normalcy, and pushed through the revolving doors. The San Francisco night air was a shock, cool and heavy with moisture, smelling of the bay and exhaust. It should have been the moment the spell broke. It should have been the moment the cold reality of the street severed the connection we'd forged in the warm, whiskey-scented air of her office. But the tether held. It stretched, taut and humming as the valet brought her car around. The street was empty, save for a few passing taxis, creating a private island on the sidewalk where the rules of the boardroom still didn't apply. She didn't get in immediately. She stood by the open door of the sedan, the interior light illuminating the tired curve of her jaw. The city noise, Distant sirens, the rumble of traffic, tried to intrude, but she ignored it. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the hesitation of the morning after, the fear that the daylight would burn this away. "Tomorrow," she said, the words sounding less like a schedule and more like a question. "I'll be there," I answered, cementing the promise. "I'm not going anywhere, Luna. The strategy has changed, but the team hasn't." The tension in her shoulders dropped another inch. "I know," she whispered. "That's what scares me. And that's what saves me." She got in, the door thudding shut with a finality that didn't feel like an ending. As the car pulled away, merging into the stream of traffic, I stood on the curb, shivering slightly, not from the cold, but from the lingering charge. The merger was signed. The war was over. But looking at the red taillights fading into the fog, I knew the real work, the terrifying, exhilarating work of being us, was just beginning. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the damp concrete grounding me while my head was still 40 floors up. The deal of the century was closed. The shareholders were safe, and the press release was cued. But as I turned to walk toward the subway, none of that mattered. The professional victory was nothing compared to the personal victory of being let in. If you've ever found love in the quiet moments after the storm, subscribe to follow where this partnership goes next.